July 8, 2015, a rural road in Hampton County, South Carolina. A 19-year-old boy is found lying in the middle of the street. His shoes are still on his feet. His phone is still in his pocket. There is no broken glass, no skid marks, no debris, no paint transfer, nothing that a hit and run should leave behind. For 8 years, the state of South Carolina told his mother that a truck mirror did this, that her son wandered into the road in the dark and was struck by a passing vehicle whose driver never stopped, never called it in, and was never found. She never believed it, not for one single day. And in March 2023, nearly 8 years after Stephen Smith died, the state of South Carolina finally agreed with her. This is the story of how a small-town death became one of the most talked-about unsolved cases in America, and why, more than a decade later, nobody has ever been arrested. Before he was a case number, Stephen Smith was just a kid from Hampton County, trying to build a life bigger than the small town he grew up in. He graduated from Wade Hampton High School in 2014, a year before he died. Those who knew him described someone who almost didn't fit the mold of a typical teenager. Quiet, thoughtful, always with a book in his hand. He wasn't chasing parties. He was chasing a career. By the summer of 2015, Stephen was enrolled at Orangeburg Calhoun Technical College, working toward becoming a nurse. Friends say it wasn't a surprise to anyone. He had always been the one people went to when they needed help, or just needed someone to listen. His classmate, Felicia Walling, remembered him simply. He was easy to talk to, and a lot of fun to be around. Even on his worst days, she said, he made everyone around him feel special. His friend Betty Ferguson said something that still echoes through every article written about this case since. She admitted that when she first heard Stephen had died, she was angry, confused. It didn't make sense to her, and it still doesn't make sense to a lot of people today. Stephen was also, quietly, figuring out who he was. Friends and family say he was in the process of discovering and coming to terms with his sexuality. He hadn't told everyone, but people close to him knew he was gay, and that detail, small as it might sound, becomes one of the most important threads in this entire case. Because on the night Stephen Smith died, he wasn't just a nursing student walking home from class. He may have been walking straight into danger from someone he trusted. Stephen had spent the evening at class. Sometime that night, driving home on Highway 601, his car ran out of gas. He was still roughly 3 miles from his home on Joe Miley Road when, according to the official account, he got out and started walking. In the early morning hours of July 8th, Stephen Smith's body was found in the middle of Sandy Run Road near Crocketville, South Carolina. The South Carolina Highway Patrol was called in immediately, not homicide detectives, not SLED, but the Highway Patrol, because from the very first moments, this was being treated as a traffic case, not a murder. And here's where the story stops making sense. Stephen had a large wound to his head. His right shoulder was dislocated. There was bruising on his right hand, the kind of bruising you might expect from someone who fought back or tried to block a blow. His phone and his keys were still in his pocket. His clothes weren't torn, and his shoes were still on his feet, loosely tied. If you know anything about how a body reacts when it's struck by a moving vehicle, that detail alone should stop you cold. When a pedestrian is hit by a car, the force of the impact routinely throws them out of their shoes. It's one of the most basic, well-documented facts in traffic fatality investigations. Stephen's shoes never moved. There were no tire tracks in the road. No skid marks, meaning if a vehicle hit him, the driver never even tried to brake. No broken glass, no pieces of a bumper, side mirror, or headlight. In hit-and-run cases involving vehicles going fast enough to kill someone, at least some physical evidence from the vehicle is almost always left behind. Here, there was nothing, and Stephen wasn't found near his car. He was found nearly 3 miles away, walking, according to the official theory, down the center line of a rural road in the middle of the night for no clear reason. His mother, Sandy Smith, never accepted it. Not the walking in the road part, not the truck mirror theory, none of it. He would have seen headlights coming. He would have gotten out of the way. He wouldn't have been struck by a mirror, not with his arm dislocated and bent behind his back like that. From day one, Sandy Smith believed her son had been murdered and that someone was working very hard to make it look like an accident. Here's where this case takes its first truly disturbing turn, because the fight over what killed Stephen Smith didn't just happen between his mother and the state. It happened inside the investigation itself. Dr. Aaron Presnell, the pathologist who examined Stephen's body, ruled that he had died from blunt force trauma consistent with being hit by a vehicle, specifically, she theorized, the side mirror of a passing truck. But less than 2 weeks after Stephen's death, Detective Todd Proctor of the South Carolina Highway Patrol tried to sit down with Dr. Presnell to go over the findings, and by his own account, that meeting went badly, almost immediately. Proctor said Dr. Presnell walked into the room already agitated, insisting there was no meeting scheduled and that she was too busy to talk. When he told her he'd already spoken to the county coroner the day before, she reportedly accused him of lying, and only backed off when he offered to call the coroner right then, on the spot, to prove it. When Proctor pushed further, asking whether Stephen's injuries could have been caused by something other than a car, like a baseball bat, Dr. Presnell conceded it was possible, but she pointed out that no weapon like that had ever been found at the scene. And then, according to Proctor, she told him something that should chill anyone paying attention to this case, that her report was only preliminary, and it was his job, not hers, to figure out what actually struck Stephen Smith. That's the pathologist, the person whose entire job is to determine cause of death, telling the lead detective that determining the cause of death wasn't really her problem. Within a matter of months, the investigation went cold. No persons of interest, no suspects, no vehicle, no leads. The case that should have triggered a full homicide investigation was quietly filed away as an unsolved hit and run, and for almost 6 years, nobody outside Hampton County was paying attention. Nobody, that is, except Sandy Smith. It's worth sitting with what those 6 years actually looked like, because the case went cold makes it sound passive, like something that just happened on its own. It didn't. Every year, Sandy Smith marked another birthday her son would never have. Every year, she called, wrote, and pushed local law enforcement for updates, and every year, she says, she was met with the same silence. She wrote letters to South Carolina's governor. She contacted the FBI directly, asking them to help crack into Stephen's cell phone, believing whatever was on it might explain what really happened that night. By her own account, an FBI agent eventually told her there was, quote, a lot of interesting information on that phone that needed to be looked at, but neither local nor state authorities pursued it further. The phone sat in evidence. The case sat in a file cabinet. And Hampton County, a small, tight-knit community where everybody seemed to know somebody connected to everybody else, simply moved on, at least publicly. Not one local news outlet outside the immediate area picked up Stephen's story in any sustained way during those years. There was no viral hashtag, no true crime podcast episode, no cable news segment. A 19-year-old was dead. His own mother was publicly insisting it was murder, and almost nobody beyond Hampton County was listening. To understand why that silence was even possible, you have to understand exactly where Stephen Smith died, and whose backyard, essentially, he died in. For nearly a century, one family effectively controlled the criminal justice system across a 5-county stretch of South Carolina's Low Country. 3 generations of Murdaughs served as the elected solicitor, the top prosecutor for the 14th Judicial Circuit, a run of unbroken power from 1920 through 2006. Alex Murdaugh's grandfather held the office. His great-grandfather held it before that. By the time Alex himself was working as a personal injury attorney at the family's law firm, the Murdaugh name didn't just carry weight in Hampton County. It effectively was the local legal system, for all intents and purposes, in the eyes of a lot of residents. Detective Todd Proctor, the same investigator who clashed with the pathologist over Stephen's cause of death, later said that some people in the area seemed genuinely afraid to say anything negative about a member of the Murdaugh family. That's not a small thing. That's a working theory for why a homicide might get quietly filed away as a traffic accident, and why witnesses who may have seen or heard something in July 2015 might have simply kept their mouths shut. This is the environment Stephen Smith died in. Not a courtroom conspiracy with men in dark suits. Just a small rural county where one family's name carried enough weight that crossing them, even just by asking too many questions, could have real consequences for your life, your job, or your standing in the community. Keep that in mind as we go through what happened next, because it explains a lot about why it took another double homicide in a completely different part of the county to finally blow this case back open. By November of 2015, Sandy Smith had started speaking to reporters, and she said something that, at the time, almost nobody outside Hampton County took seriously. She said she believed she knew who was involved. Not by name, not yet. But she described a picture that was starting to form. According to Sandy, Stephen had confided in his twin sister that he'd had a romantic relationship, a fling in his words, with another young man. The two of them had even planned a deep-sea fishing trip together for that July. Sandy believed this young man may have had something to do with her son's death, driven by a desperate need to keep his own sexuality, or his connection to Stephen, hidden. She also believed Stephen hadn't wandered onto that road at all. She was convinced he'd been taken, that a group of young men, possibly coming from a baseball game, had spotted him driving home, forced him to pull over, and that what happened next happened somewhere else before his body was placed on Sandy Run Road to make it look like an accident. And she said something else, something that, looking back, was the first public hint of where this story was actually headed. Sandy told reporters she believed the people responsible came from families with enough power and connections in Hampton County that local law enforcement would never be able to touch them. She said she'd gone all the way to the governor's office because she wasn't getting anywhere locally. She said the case needed a change of venue because there were, in her words, too many big names involved for it to ever come back to Hampton. At the time, most people reading this had no idea what name she meant. They would find out 6 years later, and the answer would make headlines around the world. Before we get to June 2021, there's one more piece of context worth knowing, because Stephen Smith's death wasn't the only questionable case connected to the Murdaugh family's orbit. In 2018, Gloria Satterfield, the family's longtime housekeeper, reportedly fell down the front steps of the Murdaugh home and later died from her injuries. Alex Murdaugh would go on to orchestrate an insurance settlement related to her death, one that, it later emerged, he stole almost the entire amount from, funneling millions of dollars meant for Satterfield's own sons into his own pocket. There was also a 2019 boat crash involving Paul Murdaugh, who was allegedly driving while intoxicated when the boat struck a bridge piling, killing 19-year-old Mallory Beach. That case, too, drew accusations that the family's influence had slowed or softened the legal consequences Paul faced. None of these cases, on their own, proves anything about what happened to Stephen Smith. But together, they paint a picture of a family whose name showed up again and again near sudden deaths and unanswered questions, and whose resources and connections seem to make each one just a little bit easier to walk away from. That pattern is exactly why, when Maggie and Paul Murdaugh turned up shot to death at the family's hunting property in June 2021, investigators and journalists alike immediately started pulling every old thread connected to the family's name. One of the very first threads they pulled was Stephen Smith's. June 7, 2021, nearly 6 years after Stephen Smith's death, a 911 call comes in from a sprawling hunting property in Colleton County, South Carolina, called Moselle. A prominent local attorney named Alex Murdaugh says he's found his wife, Maggie, and his 22-year-old son, Paul, shot to death near the dog kennels on the property. Within days, the case explodes into a national story, and buried inside the wreckage of the Murdaugh family's collapse, reporters and investigators start pulling old threads. One of those threads leads straight back to Stephen Smith. It turns out the Murdaugh name had already appeared inside the original 2015 case file, reportedly dozens of times, during the Highway Patrol's investigation into Stephen's death. And one name in particular kept surfacing in the rumors that had circulated through Hampton County for years: Buster Murdaugh, Alex Murdaugh's oldest son, and a former classmate of Stephen's. Just 2 weeks after the Moselle murders, on June 22, 2021, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, released a short, carefully worded statement. They were opening an investigation into the death of Stephen Smith, based on information gathered during the Murdaugh double murder investigation. Sandy Smith called it the happiest day of her life. 6 years of being told she was imagining things, and suddenly, the state's top law enforcement agency was telling her they needed to look at her son's case again. But then came a phone call that felt like a gut punch. According to Sandy, investigators initially called her not to update her on Stephen's case, but to ask whether her family had any connection to the shooting of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh. She called it a slap in the face after everything she'd been through. It didn't take long for investigators to rule her family out entirely. And just over a year later, in July 2022, Alex Murdaugh, the family patriarch himself, was arrested and charged with murdering his wife and son. Alex Murdaugh's trial became one of the most closely watched murder trials in modern American history. Prosecutors argued he killed Maggie and Paul to distract from a collapsing financial empire built on years of stealing from clients, including, disturbingly, some of the most vulnerable people he represented. In March 2023, after 6 weeks of testimony, a jury convicted Alex Murdaugh on both counts of murder. He continued to maintain his innocence even after the verdict. But the trial did something else, something that mattered enormously to a grieving mother 3 hours away in Hampton County. It cracked open the Murdaugh family's carefully maintained image, and with it, a wave of renewed scrutiny into every questionable death connected to their name. Just 3 weeks after Alex Murdaugh's conviction, authorities confirmed they were taking another look at Stephen Smith's death, this time as a homicide. Sandy Smith's attorneys, Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter, who had already been representing several of Alex Murdaugh's financial fraud victims, announced that SLED Chief Mark Keel had personally confirmed the case was no longer classified as vehicular manslaughter. The State Division of Law Enforcement now believed Stephen Smith had been targeted and killed. Officials later admitted something remarkable, that they had actually reopened Stephen's case, quietly, all the way back in June 2021, but deliberately waited until after Alex Murdaugh's trial concluded to move forward publicly. Their reasoning was chilling in its own right. They were afraid that witnesses wouldn't be willing to talk openly, while the Murdaugh family still held influence over the region. Sandy had been fighting for this moment for almost 8 years. Stephen was an amazing kid, and he didn't deserve to die this way. Somebody did this, and whoever it was needs to come forward and bring peace to this family. With the case finally reclassified, Sandy Smith and her legal team raised more than $130,000 through public donations to have Stephen's body exhumed for an independent second autopsy. It was performed by Dr. Michelle Dupree, a retired forensic pathologist and investigator, working alongside forensic expert Dr. Kenny Kinsey, who notably had also served as an expert witness for the prosecution in Alex Murdaugh's own murder trial. What they found directly contradicted the original theory that had stood for nearly a decade. For years, one persistent rumor in Hampton County held that Stephen had been struck with a baseball bat by someone riding in a vehicle full of young men coming home from a game. Kinsey and Dupree's independent investigation ruled that theory out. Instead, their conclusion was that Stephen died from a single, fatal blow to the head, and that he likely died right there, on the road where his body was found. Whatever hit him, Kinsey would later say, was fast, and it was large. And 2 weeks after his father's conviction, Buster Murdaugh finally broke his public silence on Stephen Smith for the first time. In a statement released through his father's attorney, he called the rumors baseless and said he unequivocally denied any involvement in Stephen's death. Months later, in a televised interview, he offered an alibi for the first time, saying he was at the family's beach house with his mother and brother the night Stephen died. It's important to say plainly what investigators themselves have said plainly. To date, no suspects or persons of interest have ever been officially named in Stephen Smith's murder. Buster Murdaugh has never been publicly identified by SLED as a suspect. His attorneys maintain there is no evidence connecting any Murdaugh to Stephen's death or to any cover-up. But the rumors, right or wrong, have never gone away, because for 8 years, nobody in power gave this case the kind of scrutiny that might have put those rumors to rest, one way or the other. It's worth pausing here to talk about the two attorneys who arguably did more to reopen this case than anyone outside of Sandy Smith herself, Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter. Bland and Richter had already made a name for themselves, representing several of Alex Murdaugh's financial fraud victims, people Murdaugh had stolen from over the better part of a decade while running his law practice. When they heard about Sandy Smith's fight, they offered to represent her, free of charge. Bland later put it simply, this was a woman who had been fighting this battle completely alone since 2015, screaming as loud as she could, in his words, with not a lot of people willing to listen. Within days of announcing they were representing her, SLED's own chief, Mark Keel, publicly acknowledged that Stephen's death was being treated as a homicide. That's not a coincidence anyone involved in this case is shy about pointing out. It took a national spotlight, a pro bono legal team with credibility in the eyes of the state, and the collapse of one of the most powerful families in South Carolina legal history for a mother's 8-year fight to finally be taken seriously. Richter has been careful, publicly, not to accuse the Murdaugh family directly. We are aware of no evidence today, he said, that would suggest that any Murdaugh played any role in Stephen Smith's death, or played any role in trying to cover up the investigation into his death. At the same time, he's acknowledged that somewhere inside the Murdaugh murder investigation, a new thread was opened that led directly back to Stephen. SLED has never fully explained what that piece of evidence actually was. That detail alone is why this case refuses to fade. Whatever SLED found while investigating Maggie and Paul's murders was significant enough to reopen an 8-year-old case that everyone had otherwise written off. And to this day, the public still doesn't know exactly what that evidence is. So where does this case stand right now? Since Stephen's death was officially ruled a homicide, SLED has said almost nothing publicly. The findings from the second autopsy remain sealed. Investigators have confirmed they now possess Stephen's old phone and tablet, evidence that sat untouched for years, even though Sandy Smith says she personally asked the FBI to try cracking his phone back in 2016. According to Sandy's attorneys, an investigative grand jury has reportedly been reviewing potential suspects in the case. In recent podcast interviews, forensic expert Kenny Kinsey, the same expert who helped debunk the baseball bat theory, has said he believes someone has a good idea who committed this crime, and that early missed opportunities in the investigation may have made the case significantly harder to solve as time passed and memories faded. SLED has also assigned a new officer to the case in recent developments, according to Stephen's legal team, as pressure to solve it continues to build heading into the case's 11th anniversary. As of today, no one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been charged. Stephen Smith's murder remains completely unsolved. In one of the most striking developments in recent memory, Kenny Kinsey, the same forensic expert who helped rule out the baseball bat theory and who testified for the prosecution against Alex Murdaugh, has now launched his own independent investigation into who actually killed Stephen. Appearing on the Criminally Obsessed podcast with investigative reporter Ann Emerson, Kinsey was careful to draw a clear line. He said he genuinely doesn't know who did it, and that determining that falls to actual investigators, not him. But he also said something that stuck with a lot of people following this case closely, that he believes someone out there already has a good idea of who's responsible. He pointed to what he calls missed opportunities in the earliest days of the investigation, the jurisdictional confusion between the highway patrol and local officials, the pathologist's resistance to even considering an alternate cause of death, the years the case simply sat untouched. Every one of those missed windows, Kinsey argues, made the case measurably harder to solve as time went on. Witnesses move away, memories blur, and as he put it bluntly on the podcast, people die. Meanwhile, Sandy Smith's fight has never really stopped. She's continued raising awareness through public appearances and interviews, and has established a scholarship fund in Stephen's name to help other students pursue the kind of nursing career he never got the chance to finish. Every July, as the anniversary of his death approaches, supporters organize memorial walks along Sandy Run Road, under the banner "Walking with Stephen," retracing the route he never made it home on, keeping his name and his case in the public eye one more year at a time. SLED has confirmed the investigation remains active. In recent statements, Sandy's legal team has said a new investigator has been assigned specifically to Stephen's case. A signal, they hope, that after years of institutional silence, there's renewed momentum behind actually solving it. But SLED itself has revealed almost nothing about what evidence they're sitting on, what the sealed second autopsy findings actually say, or whether that investigative grand jury has ever been presented with a specific name. What we know for certain is this: a 19-year-old boy who wanted to spend his life helping other people was killed on a dark road in July of 2015. For 8 years, the system told his mother it was an accident. It wasn't. And even now that the truth has been acknowledged, the person or people responsible have never had to answer for it. Before we close this out, it's worth laying out, plainly and without speculation dressed up as fact, the theories that have circulated around this case, because a responsible look at Stephen Smith's story means separating what's actually known from what's simply been rumored. Theory 1 is the original official explanation, that Stephen was struck by a vehicle, most likely by a side mirror, while walking home in the dark. This is the theory 2 independent forensic experts have now directly contradicted, citing the absence of any vehicle debris, the position of his body, and the nature of his injuries. It's also the theory the state of South Carolina itself abandoned in March 2023, when it reclassified the case as a homicide. Theory 2 is the version that circulated locally for years, that Stephen was struck by someone wielding a baseball bat from inside a moving vehicle. This was the theory Kenny Kinsey and Dr. Michelle Dupree's independent autopsy specifically ruled out, concluding instead that he was struck by something described as fast and large, in a single fatal blow, and that he most likely died right there on the road. Theory 3, and the one Sandy Smith has believed from day one, is that Stephen was deliberately targeted, killed elsewhere or on that exact stretch of road by someone he may have known, and that the scene was arranged afterward to resemble an accident. This is the theory that aligns most closely with what the second autopsy found, and it's the working theory that appears to be driving SLED's current homicide investigation. What ties every version of this case together, no matter which theory you find most convincing, is this. For 8 years, the system chose the explanation that required no further investigation, no uncomfortable questions, and no scrutiny of anyone with power or connections in Hampton County. It took another family tragedy on a completely unrelated property to force anyone to look again. This case isn't about a famous family, and it never should have been. It's about a kid named Stephen Smith, who deserved to make it home that night, and whose mother has spent more than a decade refusing to let the world forget him. If you have any information about what happened to Stephen Smith, you're urged to contact the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division. There is currently a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction in this case. What do you think really happened on that road? Do you believe the truth will ever come out? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to be here the moment there's any new development in this case, an arrest, a name, anything, make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell turned on. Because when it happens, I'll be the first to cover it, and I want you to be the first to know.